Welcome to another in the series of Why Study, which is being produced by the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at the University of Nottingham. I'm joined today by Professor Tom O'Loughlin, who is Professor of Historical Theology at Nottingham, and he is going to answer the question, why study the Didache? So Tom, why study the Didache?
Well, first of all, let me tell you a little bit about the Didache, because it's one of those documents that a lot of people have heard about, but very few people know anything more than the name. We have known for the whole history of Christianity that there was a document wandering around the early church called the Didache. The word Didache is the Greek word for training or teaching, but let's not get hung up on the idea of teaching. The real thing is the instruction, the training. And Eusebius says at the beginning of the 4th century, well, there was this document which everyone thought was terribly important called the Didache, but it's now disappeared and no one knows where it is. And then lo and behold, in 1873, a guy called Philotheus Bryennios was rooting through the manuscripts in a library in Constantinople, Istanbul, and he found a little text, and it was called the Didache of the 12 Apostles, the instruction of the 12 Apostles. Now, unlike most librarians, at the time, this guy had actually been trained in early Christian history. So the minute he saw this, he realized he had struck gold. So in 1873, suddenly a text that had been lost for 1500 years came out into the open again. He had been trained in Germany, so within a couple of years he had produced an edition in Greek, and then it was translated into German, French and English, and from the 1880s this document has been available to us. And as a training, it is one of the oldest documents of Christianity. It belongs to the period before 70. It belongs to the period before the synagogue and the church have drawn asunder. So here are a community who to the outside world would have looked like Jews, but they themselves were followers of Jesus. Now, Christians, of course, know lots of documents from the 1st century. They know the Gospels, they know the Epistles. The Epistles are contemporary with the Didache. The Gospels are later than the Didache. But they're so used to them, and that they've often failed to see how different the world of the first Christians was. And number two, St. Paul is a theologian answering questions. The Gospels are big narratives, and we tend to look on them as books. But the training, the Didache, is rules. It's about how the community lived. So you don't get theory, you don't get big stories, you get an insight into how people thought and lived as Christians.
So what does it actually say?
Well, it begins with something that looks rather boring. It's called the two ways. On the one hand, there is the way of life, and on the other hand, there is the way of death. And the way of life is a whole series of thou shalt nots, very similar to what Christians would call the 10 Commandments, except that there's added section. There's the golden rule in its negative form. Do not do to others as you would not have them do unto you. And there is the whole Christian message of love thy neighbour. But the really important thing to remember is, where does the idea of the way of life and death come from? It comes from the very last words that are put into the mouth of Moses in the book of Deuteronomy. So these people are seeing themselves as the community of the covenant with God, and this covenant is the way to life, but this covenant has been renewed and transformed through their encounter with Jesus. So it shows us that they don't see themselves as primarily followers of Jesus. They see themselves as having been shown by Jesus how to be the perfect followers in the perfection of the covenant, and they are now addressing God not as a distant being, but as Father. And so, for instance, we hear in the Didache that they're going to pray to God as our Father, and they recite the Lord's Prayer 3 times a day. So it shows us a community which is steeped in the practices of Judaism, but they see these practices as transformed and given a new insight through Jesus, whom they are addressing as Son of David and as the child of the Father. So, why study the Didache? If you want to see the earliest Christian community at work and at prayer, then in 20 minutes you can get an insight. So this film is going to last for 10 minutes. Twice the length it takes to watch this film is as long as it takes to read the Didache. And you will see about how they saw themselves as a community of the covenant, the first several chapters, 6 chapters. Then if you have decided that you're interested, the Didache, by the way, was instruction for people who were thinking of becoming followers of Jesus, and it assumes that many of the people who are going to become followers are actually Gentiles. They're not people who are Jews. So it says, so the first thing is they've got to learn the way of the covenant. They've got to learn how to behave. It's not about, you don't begin to be a follower of Jesus by a whole series of beliefs. You begin to be a follower of Jesus by learning a way of life. And this is the way of life. And then the next thing is to identify with the community. So it gives instructions on baptism. And it sees baptism as not a declaration of what you believe in, though it has the famous formula of Trinitarian baptism that Christians are familiar with from their own liturgy and from the end of the Gospel of Matthew. But that's identifying. You're identifying with a group. And this would have been a small group. This would have been a group that could have gathered for a meal in a house. So having talked about baptism and gathering, the next thing it moves on to is the Christian meal. This would later become formalized as a very ritual thing called the Eucharist. In the Didache, it's called the Eucharist. It says, when you want to say your thanksgiving, give your Eucharist to the Father. This is how you do it. But you're actually doing it in the context of a big proper meal. So this is a community that is small enough to know one another. It's small enough to gather in a house and to actually have a real meal. And we know that they were gathering weekly for this meal. And we know the prayers they were saying. And then, well, any community has got to have organisation. So we hear about the group who are organising it. And you as a theologian will be glad to know that the great, very important group travelling around these communities are the teachers. And it's these sort of travelling teachers that will later produce our evangelists. And within the community itself, well, communities need organisation. So there are a group called the bishops and deacons. Not bishops and deacons as modern Christians would expect, but the overseers, the bishops, are also the servants. So there's only one type of people, but they've got two names. It's like a vitler and contractor. The bishops, deacons, and they organise the group, and then of course in every group you've always got to be worried about people who are on the make. So there are instructions about how do you know the people who are visiting you are actually genuine people who are actually in need of your hospitality. Well, it says feed them, give them 3 days hospitality, and if after that they don't want to work, chuck them out. So the community has to be. It shows you the nitty gritty of what it was to be a disciple of Jesus in the first century, and then finally it ends with a statement of Christian hope. So there you are. I've tried to summarise 20 minutes in less than 10.
Yes, that's extraordinary. Okay, so I'd like to read the Didache. What should I be reading? How can I read the text, and what can I read about the Didache?
Well, the Didache itself is available in umpteen translations, and it takes 20 minutes to read, and there is actually a translation at the back of this book done by myself. If you want to read about the Didache, I'm going to be immodest and say, well, you've heard me now for 10 minutes. That's the result of 25 years of trying to teach the Didache. And I'm not finished with the Didache by any means. I've been amazed It takes 20 minutes to read, and I've got lectures for the last 30 years out of it, and I suspect I'll do it for the next 30, but this is the book.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Tom. I think your enthusiasm for the Didache has come over to us very powerfully. It's extraordinary to me that an account of the earliest Christians can have remained undiscovered until 1873. Thank you very much, Tom.